Hey friends, I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
The morning began like any other, quiet and unremarkable, yet beneath the surface, a subtle tension of unacknowledged efforts had begun to accumulate in her mind. She moved through her routine, oblivious to the invisible scaffolding that had been carefully constructed around her by him over months, even years. Each small task she completed, each challenge she navigated with apparent ease, had been softened by his presence, his guidance, and his silent support. She remembered the times she had taken for granted the emotional stability he provided, the late night conversations where he listened without judgment, and the countless moments where he had offered practical help without expecting acknowledgement. At the time, she had brushed these acts aside, deeming them normal, routine, or perhaps even owed, never considering the depth of care and attention they represented. Her focus had been entirely inward, preoccupied with her own ambitions, concerns, and immediate needs, and in that focus, the quiet constancy of his support had faded into the background. She reflected, often without realizing it, on how seamlessly he had integrated himself into the flow of her life, the way he anticipated challenges before they fully emerged, and the unspoken understanding that seemed to guide his every action, every small gesture, from preparing a thoughtful meal when she had a long day, to remembering details she had shared in passing, to stepping in when circumstances threatened to overwhelm her, had accumulated into a fabric of care that she had scarcely noticed. Her pride and busyness had blinded her to the significance of these contributions, framing them as minor conveniences rather than acts of devotion. She considered the myriad ways he had gone above and beyond, often without recognition, imagining how much of her own ease and stability was due to his presence. The realization that these efforts had gone unthanked created a subtle, gnawing discomfort, an emotional echo she could no longer ignore. She traced the pattern of her neglect, recalling moments where a simple word of gratitude, a gesture of acknowledgement, or even a smile could have conveyed the appreciation that she had left unspoken. The cumulative weight of these unexpressed thanks now pressed upon her awareness, forming a quiet but persistent tension between what she felt and what she had expressed. She began to understand the fragility of recognition, how easily acts of care can be rendered invisible when overlooked, and how the absence of acknowledgement can shape both perception and relational dynamics. Observing the way he had quietly supported her through challenges, she noted the consistency and thoughtfulness embedded in his actions, a pattern that spoke not only to commitment but to profound attentiveness and empathy. Each reflection deepened her appreciation, revealing a web of interconnected moments where his presence had altered outcomes, softened hardships, and provided stability in ways she had assumed were natural or automatic. She recognized the danger in taking such support for granted, the way habitual invisibility can erode relational intimacy and emotional resonance over time. As she traced these realizations, she felt an emerging sense of responsibility, not as a burden but as a call to awareness, a recognition that acknowledgement, gratitude, and presence are as vital to sustaining relationships as the acts themselves. She noted the contrast between the apparent simplicity of his gestures and the profound impact they had on her life. Understanding that what had seemed minor was, in fact, foundational, her thoughts drifted to specific instances where his support had been critical, moments of professional stress where guidance had prevented mistakes, personal challenges where encouragement had alleviated anxiety, and everyday decisions where his foresight had quietly safeguarded her comfort or security. Each memory was a reminder of her own oversight, a reflection on how easily one can become accustomed to kindness, and a lesson in the importance of conscious recognition. By the end of the morning, she was enveloped in a complex awareness, gratitude mingled with regret, reflection intertwined with newfound admiration, and an emergent desire to bridge the gap between feeling and expression. She recognized that her journey was just beginning, that understanding the depth of his support required not only reflection but eventual acknowledgement, and that the path forward would demand both honesty and intentionality. In this realization, she found the first stirrings of change, a seed of awareness that would grow into a commitment to seeing, valuing, and honoring the quiet, persistent care that had shaped so much of her life without her explicit recognition. As the days unfolded, she became increasingly aware of the countless ways in which his support had silently shaped her life. Each morning, the realization settled heavier on her consciousness, a quiet pressure of regret mingled with admiration, as she traced the tapestry of his care through the routines and moments she had once taken for granted. She recalled the small acts that had once seemed insignificant, the way he remembered subtle details of her schedule, anticipated obstacles before they appeared, or offered guidance that prevented minor crises from escalating. These gestures, repeated with consistency and patience, now appeared in stark relief, and the absence of acknowledgement from her own lips weighed on her with mounting clarity. She reflected on her prior preoccupation with her own world, her focus on immediate concerns and personal ambitions, which had blinded her to the labor of love embedded in his everyday actions. Each effort he had made, whether helping with logistical challenges, providing emotional steadiness, or offering encouragement during moments of doubt, had been quietly transformative, forming the invisible scaffolding that supported her progress. In those reflections, she recognized how easily one can overlook devotion when it is consistent, subtle, and unassuming. Pride and self-absorption had obscured her perception, leading her to assume that support was automatic or owed, rather than a deliberate and generous choice. She considered the relational dynamics that had allowed such oversight to persist, understanding that familiarity can breed a dangerous sense of entitlement, and that habitual neglect of acknowledgement erodes not only intimacy but also mutual understanding and emotional reciprocity. Observing herself in this light, she felt both regret and a growing desire to correct the imbalance, to bridge the gap between perception and action, between feeling gratitude internally and expressing it outwardly. She examined specific instances of his care, the late nights he spent helping her navigate professional challenges, the way he had listened attentively when she vented, the quiet encouragement that bolstered her confidence, and the practical interventions that smoothed her daily life. Each recollection reinforced the magnitude of his contributions, amplifying the emotional weight of her delayed appreciation. She realized that the absence of explicit thanks had created a subtle shift in relational dynamics, introducing an imbalance that had gone unnoticed until now. Reflection deepened, highlighting patterns of human behavior, the tendency to overlook consistent kindness, the ease of taking support for granted, and the cognitive blindness that often accompanies self-centered focus. She understood that acknowledgement is not merely a social nicety but a vital component of relational health, and that without it, even the most well-intentioned actions can feel invisible, undervalued, or unrecognized. Emotionally, she oscillated between admiration, guilt, and longing, feeling the dual impact of recognizing the depth of his care while simultaneously confronting her own neglect. These reflections prompted a subtle shift in awareness, encouraging her to observe daily interactions with greater attentiveness and to actively cultivate gratitude in both thought and potential action. She began to consider the pathways through which she could express recognition, weighing the timing, method, and sincerity required to convey acknowledgement that would resonate meaningfully. The cognitive process was intricate. She balanced introspection with planning, reflection with anticipation, and regret with hope. Each thought reinforced the necessity of transforming awareness into tangible expression, recognizing that acknowledgement validates not only the giver but also strengthens relational bonds. She noted the delicate interplay between internal recognition and external articulation, understanding that gratitude must be both felt and communicated to achieve its full effect. By the end of the day, her mind was rich with reflection. The previously invisible scaffolding of support now stood vividly before her, a testament to his patience, care, and steadfast presence. The chapter concluded with a deepening emotional resonance, a recognition that her journey toward acknowledgement was underway, and an emerging understanding that conscious attention to both perception and action is essential in honoring those whose quiet support forms the foundation of our daily lives. With the growing awareness of his constant support, she entered a deeper phase of reflection where the weight of unexpressed gratitude began to settle heavily upon her consciousness. Each memory of his patience and attention became a vivid tableau, highlighting the innumerable ways he had contributed to her life without ever demanding recognition. She recalled the quiet evenings when he had simply listened, absorbing her anxieties and frustrations without judgment, offering reassurance that had allowed her to face challenges with greater confidence. She thought of the practical help he had provided, organizing tasks, anticipating obstacles, and stepping in seamlessly to alleviate stress that had once seemed ordinary but now revealed itself as extraordinary in its impact. The sheer consistency of his care struck her profoundly. It had been unassuming, repetitive, and unobtrusive, yet its cumulative effect was the very foundation upon which much of her stability rested. She began to consider the psychology of invisibility in human relationships, recognizing how repeated, low-profile acts of kindness often go unnoticed, taken for granted by those most familiar with them. Her own preoccupation with daily concerns, personal ambitions, and internal narratives had blinded her to this reality, leaving her gratitude unspoken and her appreciation dormant. This realization stirred within her a potent mixture of guilt and admiration, an acute awareness of the imbalance that had existed in their relational dynamic. She pondered how pride and habitual focus on her own perspective had prevented acknowledgement, how the absence of explicit thanks might have left him feeling unseen, despite his unwavering efforts. Emotional introspection deepened as she traced back to specific moments, the times he had anticipated needs before she articulated them, the subtle ways he had facilitated opportunities, and the quiet reassurance he provided that kept her moving forward when self-doubt threatened to stall her. She became increasingly conscious of the relational significance of these acts, understanding that acknowledgement is not simply courteous but foundational to sustaining trust, intimacy, and mutual respect. The thought of what it meant to have neglected this acknowledgement stirred a reflective tension, regret intertwined with appreciation, remorse tempered by recognition of her prior ignorance. She observed how human perception is selective, how the mind can discount ongoing support as background noise, and how absence or withdrawal often illuminates the true value of what had been quietly present all along. In this reflective space, she also considered his perspective, imagining the patience, resilience, and generosity required to continue supporting someone without consistent recognition. She recognized that the depth of his care was a reflection of commitment and character, qualities she had failed to honor adequately in the past. Each recollection prompted her to think critically about relational reciprocity, the importance of acknowledgement, and the subtle ways unspoken gratitude can shape dynamics over time. She noted that awareness alone was insufficient. The recognition had to be translated into expression, action, or other tangible forms to validate and honor his contributions. Emotionally, she experienced oscillations between longing, remorse, and a deep sense of connection that had been previously unarticulated. Her mind explored scenarios of expression, letters, conversations, gestures, each potential pathway serving as both a means of reconciliation and a mechanism for internal closure. She realized that these acts were not merely performative but essential for sustaining relational balance, for translating awareness into a living acknowledgement that could reinforce the bonds he had worked to maintain. By the end of the reflection, she had developed a layered understanding, Gratitude is an active, conscious practice. Visibility of support is relationally essential, and acknowledgement bridges the gap between effort and recognition. The chapter closed with a growing commitment to transform insight into action, and understanding that her awareness of his contributions was both a privilege and a responsibility, and that honoring his unwavering support required more than internal recognition. It demanded deliberate, thoughtful expression that could fully convey the depth of her appreciation. The realization of how much he had done for her settled into a deeper emotional space, where reflection intertwined with the quiet ache of belated appreciation. She began to perceive the breadth and depth of his support in ways that were both humbling and illuminating. Every gesture, once unnoticed or assumed, now stood out as a deliberate act of care, a conscious choice to invest time, energy, and attention in her well-being without demanding anything in return. She reflected on the subtle ways he had anticipated her needs before she was even aware of them, the quiet consistency of his actions that had created stability and ease in her life. From managing logistical details she hadn't even considered to offering emotional scaffolding during moments of self-doubt, his support had been an invisible but foundational element of her daily existence. She recognized how easily she had overlooked these contributions, caught up in her own preoccupations, priorities, and habitual focus on immediate concerns. The lens of hindsight sharpened her perception, revealing the intricate ways in which he had woven himself into the fabric of her life, often smoothing challenges and absorbing stress that she had never acknowledged. With this recognition came a surge of regret, a poignant awareness that gratitude had not been expressed when it was most meaningful. She considered the relational consequences of taking consistent support for granted, understanding that even the most patient and generous individuals may eventually feel unseen or unappreciated when their contributions are perpetually unrecognized. She examined her own patterns, noting the cognitive blind spots that had allowed her to assume his efforts were expected, natural, or trivial rather than extraordinary and worthy of acknowledgement. Emotionally, the landscape was complex. Admiration, remorse, longing, and the newfound sense of responsibility intertwined to create a powerful internal tension. She felt compelled to translate this awareness into action, to find ways to communicate appreciation that were authentic, meaningful, and reflective of the depth of her recognition. The chapter explored the psychology of gratitude, emphasizing how acknowledgement strengthens relational bonds, validates effort, and reinforces the dynamics of mutual care. She reflected on missed opportunities to express thanks, to offer gestures of recognition, and to verbally affirm his presence and support, understanding that these omissions had created subtle but enduring relational gaps. In observing him, even indirectly, she noted the patience and resilience required to continue providing support without consistent acknowledgement, deepening her admiration and reinforcing the imperative to respond with intentional appreciation. She began to visualize the integration of gratitude into her daily interactions, contemplating both immediate gestures and long-term practices that would convey recognition effectively. Each recollection of his contributions reinforced the significance of intentional acknowledgement. Small actions, when paired with authentic expression of appreciation, could restore balance, strengthen connection, and honor the sustained care he had offered. By the end of the reflection, she had developed a nuanced understanding of relational dynamics. Consistent support, when unrecognized, risks invisibility. Gratitude is both an emotional and active practice, and acknowledging effort transforms perception, deepens intimacy, and fosters mutual respect. The chapter closed with an emergent determination to bridge the gap between awareness and expression, to move beyond internal recognition toward tangible, meaningful acts of appreciation, and to ensure that the depth of his care was fully seen, honored, and reciprocated in ways that could reinforce the enduring value of their connection. As her reflections deepened, she began to confront the tangible consequences of her delayed acknowledgement, realizing that understanding alone was insufficient without deliberate action. The awareness of how much he had contributed to her life stirred a potent combination of admiration, gratitude, and regret, each emotion layered and interwoven with the next. She considered the relational patterns that had allowed her to overlook his efforts for so long, the habitual focus on her own experiences, the unconscious assumption that his support was an expected backdrop rather than a deliberate investment, and the subtle ways in which familiarity had bred a kind of invisibility around his care. She observed how these patterns had shaped her responses, leaving her gestures of recognition minimal or absent, and how over time this neglect could erode relational closeness despite his enduring patience. With growing clarity, she began to map the specific acts of support that had been most significant, the times he had anticipated difficulties before she even perceived them, the quiet interventions that smoothed the challenges of her daily life, and the consistent emotional presence that had allowed her to pursue ambitions and face setbacks with confidence. Each recollection amplified her sense of responsibility, highlighting that gratitude is not merely a courtesy but a relational necessity, a conscious effort to validate, honor, and reciprocate care. She reflected on the psychological dimensions of acknowledgement, recognizing that unexpressed gratitude can unintentionally diminish the perceived value of contributions and that timely, sincere recognition strengthens trust, intimacy, and mutual respect. Emotionally, she navigated a spectrum of experience, a deep admiration for his generosity, a persistent pang of guilt for prior inattention, and an emerging motivation to act in a way that genuinely honored the magnitude of his support. She considered the methods of expression available to her, from verbal acknowledgement and written correspondence to thoughtful gestures that demonstrated awareness of his sacrifices and attentiveness. Each potential action required careful consideration to ensure that it conveyed authenticity, respect, and sincerity, avoiding perfunctory or superficial gestures that might undermine the depth of her recognition. As she analyzed relational dynamics, she recognized that her own emotional growth was inseparable from the quality and intentionality of her responses. The chapter explored the balance between internal awareness and external action, illustrating that genuine gratitude necessitates translation from thought to practice, from recognition to demonstration, and from realization to relational reinforcement. She also considered the broader implications of sustained, silent support, noting how consistently unacknowledged efforts, though offered willingly, can create subtle relational tensions, erode morale, or foster emotional distance if left without validation. This reflection prompted a commitment to recalibrate her interactions, integrating mindfulness, empathy, and intentional acknowledgement into daily practice. She envisioned a future in which her gratitude was not reactive but habitual, a conscious and continuous effort to honor contributions in the moment rather than retrospectively. In this visualization, she mapped pathways of relational repair, understanding that acknowledgement is both preventive and restorative. It nurtures connection, reinforces trust, and deepens intimacy while also correcting imbalances created by prior neglect. By the end of the chapter, she had cultivated a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between awareness, acknowledgement, and relational health. The reflection underscored the necessity of acting on insight, transforming appreciation from an internal recognition into tangible gestures that reinforce connection and demonstrate value. She felt the growing impetus to bridge the gap between realization and expression, embracing both the challenge and responsibility of honoring the unseen labor that had supported her life, and committing to a sustained practice of gratitude that could restore balance and deepen relational resonance in meaningful and enduring ways. By the time the final chapter unfolded, the weight of unacknowledged support had fully settled into her awareness, creating a profound sense of responsibility and clarity about the depth of his care. She reflected on the countless moments that had shaped her life in ways she had once assumed were natural or owed, now seeing them as deliberate, thoughtful acts that had been offered consistently and without expectation of recognition. The magnitude of these contributions became vivid, each memory serving as a reminder of patience, foresight, and unwavering presence that had quietly sustained her through challenges both large and small. She considered the emotional and relational emotional implications of her delayed gratitude, understanding that acknowledgement is more than a formality. It is the mechanism through which relational bonds are reinforced, trust is sustained, and the value of support is validated. Emotionally, she navigated a complex landscape of admiration, longing, remorse, and determination, each feeling interlaced with the next, forming a tapestry of awareness that demanded careful consideration and eventual action. She reflected on the subtle ways her previous neglect may have influenced his perception, recognizing that even unintentional oversight can alter relational dynamics over time, creating distance or diminishing emotional resonance. This insight prompted her to consider deliberate strategies for expressing appreciation to bridge the gap between internal recognition and observable acknowledgement. She envisioned tangible acts of gratitude, words, gestures, and consistent attention that could convey the depth of her awareness and respect for his contributions. These reflections also highlighted the importance of timing and sincerity, understanding that acknowledgement must be authentic and meaningful to truly restore relational equilibrium. She considered the broader lessons embedded in this realization: the fragility of relational health, the compounding effects of unacknowledged care, and the transformative power of intentional recognition. Each insight reinforced the imperative to integrate awareness into consistent practice, to move beyond internal reflection toward concrete action that honors both the effort and the person behind it. As she contemplated the trajectory of their relationship, she recognized that reconciliation and reaffirmation are iterative processes requiring not only acknowledgement of past oversight but sustained engagement, empathy, and attentiveness moving forward. The emotional weight of her reflections deepened as she considered the psychological mechanisms by which habitual support can be rendered invisible, and the ways in which conscious acknowledgement can reverse the subtle erosion of intimacy and trust. She recognized that her own growth was inseparable from her ability to act on insight, to translate understanding into gestures that communicate respect, value, and appreciation. By the end of the chapter, she had cultivated a comprehensive understanding of relational dynamics, the essential nature of acknowledgement, and the interplay between consistent support and emotional visibility. She understood that gratitude is both an internal and external practice, a conscious, ongoing effort to honor the quiet labor of care that shapes life in profound but often unrecognized ways. The chapter closed with a commitment to transform insight into sustained action, ensuring that the depth of his contributions would no longer remain invisible, and that her recognition would become a living, continuous testament to his patience, foresight, and unwavering support, fostering connection, intimacy, and mutual respect in ways that could endure far beyond a single moment of reflection.
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.